O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy.
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are discussing the Great Awakening, or what some people call the First Great Awakening, in the mid-1700s. In England, or Great Britain, it was called the Evangelical Revival. It was the next major, after the Enlightenment, it was the next major event after the colonization in Western history, after the colonization of America, at least for the American colonies. The Great Awakening is seen by many historians, most historians, as a huge turning point in Western Christianity, as a huge turning point in the development of the American colonies, as a huge turning point in the history of Great Britain. It brought about many tremendous changes in religion, in society, in the thinking in general of people. To give a little bit of background, so we are in the early 1700s. The American colonies are pretty much they're still spreading out. They're still working out their kinks. I think in the 1730s, was it, when the French and Indian War was fought?
So the French and Indian War was a little bit later. However, there were several wars between European powers from, I think there were like 4 from 1700 to 7. So I'm not sure which one was going on or close to there, but it was basically always war between some of the European powers. Right.
Great Britain was certainly always trying to wage conflicts, but the main period we're talking about here before the Great Awakening is the Enlightenment. So Casey, I'm not really that well versed in the Enlightenment. I know it had certain key figures such as John Locke, I think Thomas Hobbes. But could you give a general overview of the Enlightenment?
I wouldn't call that my specialty, but so in general, people give dates for it as starting in around 1690. Some say 1688. So 1688 was the Glorious Revolution, if you remember, in England, where James II basically is kicked out for William of Orange. And the reason this is given as a date is because this is when a whole culture is basically rejecting the divine right of kings and saying, we just want the best person for the king. That fits our needs. So this is sometimes given, 1690 is sometimes given because of, Isaac Newton was when he published whatever work it was that had a whole bunch of math stuff that basically still drives mathematics today. Or physics, or sorry if you're really into that. Yeah, sorry if you're really into that and I just butchered it. But so those are a lot of times the starting dates given, and then it runs for like a century. And generally, it's just the idea of human reason. That we can figure things out, that things make sense. Less of a focus on the supernatural and more understanding how things function. Part of this was because of Isaac Newton. Basically, and Isaac Newton was a Christian, and saying that like God ordered the universe in a way that makes sense. And so part of this was a Christian thought of saying things should make sense because God ordered them that way. So let's figure it out. This definitely though resulted in kind of a general movement away from Christianity, and more focus on man and their ability to reason, but it wasn't necessarily anti-Christian.
Eventually it
did. But at first, most of the people doing it are Christians and seeing it as I said, like Isaac Newton, as a God ordered the universe, so we should be able to understand it.
I think I don't know what your opinion on this is, but I think in continental Europe was where the seedbed of the atheistic form of enlightenment, especially in France.
Paris was a big place where they would gather, and you get more and more philosophers that that are seeing things not quite existential yet, but kind of like you can see it heading that way, where much less focus on God and more just like, see, it's not this idea too in general that like beforehand, I'll give a bad example, but your cow dies, and before this you'd think, what have I done? You know, why is God doing this to me now? You know, what's he trying to say to me? And then after the Enlightenment, you get all right, so you don't have a great science explanation for it, but you know, it got sick somehow and it died. That happens. Yeah. Like, that's how you see it.
Right. And would you say the Enlightenment was kind of a carryover from the Renaissance?
Oh yeah.
Like it's kind of the natural fruit of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
It was still you know, it was still that thought and those practices were still developing throughout the Reformation era. And there's probably a pushback against the Reformation, against spiritual revival, by unbelievers.
I'd definitely say that. I'd even go further than that to say, as you keep going forward, as I kind of mentioned, like, you get existentialism out of this eventually, when you're like focusing on yourself, on humans, and away from God, and you reach the conclusion that, oh, it's kind of meaningless in the end. Yeah. And then now we're in this like postmodern society where it's like, what even, you know, how do you even try to interpret things? And they all mean different things. It's like, I think it all just goes right in order.
Right. Well, some people would say it's actually past postmodern.
Yeah, sorry, I know. I thought that as I said
it. It's anti-Christian, completely anti-Christian. But anyway, so
another thing I wanted to mention, separate from the Enlightenment, that is also going into this Great Awakening. In the 1600s, there were a lot of wars in Europe, specifically about religious. Wars, yeah, so we get the English Civil War
between Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah, the English Civil War, which we covered. We've talked a little bit about the 30 Years' War in Germany. There's the Protestant Wars in France. Yeah. And so I think you get this sentiment by the end of this of kind of like, if like at the end of World War I, where people are like, never again, let this be the war that ended all wars. Yeah. Kind of people are like, that was terrible. Like, we gotta not be so hot about religion. Like, let's just cool it down. Bible. So I think you get that kind of going into this too. So then it leads into what the general culture is like before the Great Awakening.
Yeah. So let's focus on Great Britain in the early 1700s. So because of the Enlightenment ideas, which were pushed by the scientists, and then probably it was spread to the aristocracy, probably to political figures that were in power, also in the higher educational institutions, and then basically to the general public, but also probably I would say I would have to guess. I don't read or study anything specifically about this, but I'm sure that those Enlightenment ideas were spread also to the religious institutions, the seminaries.
Well, and if you remember, you know, after the Restoration, you know, especially in England that we're looking, you've got this Anglicanism that's just based on the liturgy and the homilies that are handed down. That they're not super biblically educated. A lot of times you don't even have people that are able to really preach a message. And so it'd be easy for them to be influenced more by these ideas than the Bible itself.
Yeah, which is surprising because, I mean, for example, what Cambridge was just a huge center for learning. I mean, I'd say a part of the clergy were that way, but also I'm pretty sure at least most of the clergy that at least went to the major major seminaries such as Cambridge were highly educated in the original languages, and in church, and patristic fathers, the church fathers and things. Because I know from my study of the Wesleys and of Whitefield, they were very well educated in Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and they had read all the major works.
I think the issue was more that you get this educated, major works read, biblical group is just much smaller than what the clergy was. Yeah. There was a lot more clergy, and you get all these backwater towns that have a priest that isn't at all educated.
Yeah, and he just got into the priesthood so that he could get paid and have an easy job. Have an easy life.
And they give him the homily that he reads on Sunday.
Right.
And that's their church.
Yeah, and the Church of England, we have to remember, was the main church denomination in England.
And I think that's why you see, like, with the Wesleys and Whitefield, as they get educated and looking at the church, they're not that happy with the Anglican Church. You know, they think it needs a lot of improvement and reform.
Yeah, we'll talk about them a little later, but just to give some testimonies from that time about the condition of England, some quotations here. William Blackstone was an English jurist and politician. He wrote something about the laws of England. He lived at this time. He visited the church of every major clergyman in London and did not hear a single discourse which had more Christianity in it than the writings of Cicero, who was a Roman orator.
Who is not at all a Christian, not even aware of Christianity.
Right. One historian describes England as one vast casino, because gambling was such a popular pastime. And then this bishop named George Berkeley, he wrote that morality and religion in Britain had collapsed to a degree that was never known in any Christian country. So these are a few testimonies about the condition of England. Drunkenness was huge. Prostitution was huge. I think I also learned in my studies that child prostitution was actually a huge thing at this time in Great Britain.
I could believe it. I mean, I know I've never read anything on that, but the state of like orphans and children in England and London was just terrible. Like no rights, and if you're an orphan, like people just scoop you up and do what they wanted with you. I mean, usually what I've read is towards like child labor.
Yeah.
But I imagine that would happen too because of the depravity of man.
Right. So basically, when we look at Great Britain in the early 1700s, we're looking at a nominally Christian, pseudo-Christian, basically mostly pagan society with, they just claim to be Christians for the most part. And as we already noted, most of the clergy were most likely they did not, at least in the Anglican Church, the established church, did not know the Lord. They were unsaved. So you come into this context, and you have the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley, and George Whitefield, who began in the same way that most of the clergy did, by studying at, I think it was Cambridge that they went to, right?
I don't remember which one.
Cambridge or Oxford. Yeah. Those are the two main ones, which I'm pretty... No, it was Oxford. I'm pretty sure it's Oxford, if I remember correctly. But they were unsaved, and they went to study to become clergy, to become priests eventually. And but they came to the conviction that, I don't know how they came to this conviction, but that they needed to be way holier than most of their fellow students. Way more devoted to godliness. So they formed the Holy Club, which was a select group that they would gather together for Bible study, and believe it or not, for prayer, even though they didn't know the Lord, and for fasting, and for giving to charity. And Whitefield especially, he was the most zealous of them. He was kind of like Martin Luther. He was tormented by the fact that he knew he was not righteous, and that he needed to make up for his sins and pay for his sins through his good works. So he would actually dress as plainly as possible. He lived basically on nothing. He ate virtually nothing, to the point where one year he was so sickly that he was confined to his bed for a huge period of time. He had to be cared for by a doctor because of the fact that he was fasting so much, to basically do penance for his sins, to earn favor with God. And John Wesley and Charles Wesley were quite the same. In fact, So John and Charles, they were the first ones. They thought in order to, be faithful to God, to win His favor, they would go to the American colonies, to Georgia, on a mission trip and preach the gospel. And John Wesley was, the gospel that they called the gospel. It was most likely not the true gospel. It was probably a gospel of works.
Yeah.
But on the way back from that mission trip, John Wesley was with the Moravians, they were a zealous group of believers from continental Europe, near I think the Germany area, right? Somewhere around Germany. I think they were Germans. Yeah, the Moravians. They were zealous. They were the first out of the Protestant Reformation, the first major missionary group that went all across the globe preaching the gospel. But they shared with John the true gospel, that we are not saved by our deeds, but we are saved simply by putting our trust in Jesus and relying upon Him and His grace and His mercy to receive salvation. And this convicted him because he realized that they had a peace of God, because during the voyage they were in fear. Well, they came into some danger where the ship was in danger of capsizing or something, and the Moravians were clearly calm and had peace, and they were even joyful, singing hymns and praying to God. And John Wesley was terrified that he was going to die, and so this convicted him that he didn't have the peace of God, and he wanted what they had. So after he got back to England, he had a friend, a Moravian friend, who continued to share with him the true gospel, the truths of the gospel. And eventually he went to a meeting where the gospel was preached, and he says in his own testimony, "I felt my heart strangely warmed, and I felt that I believed that I did trust in Christ." So he came to assurance of salvation, that he finally had God's peace and forgiveness simply by putting his faith in Jesus. So I forgot when that was. Early 1700s. Oh, 1738. So Wesley was saved. He was still a part of the Church of England. He was a Church of England minister. Charles Wesley, I think, was saved shortly thereafter. And also George Whitefield around this time.
I think he was a little bit before. And actually, because I think, was it Charles Wesley gave him a book to read or something?
Well, someone did. It was called The Life of God and the Soul of Man by Henry Scroogle, who was a Puritan author. And he came to salvation after much turmoil of soul, kind of like Bunyan. But eventually, he came to salvation, and he started preaching. What was the year that he started preaching? It was 1738.
It may have been a year or two ahead of that, but that's right in the ballpark, though. I think 1738 was his first trip to America.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So George Whitefield, he started preaching in churches.
Yeah.
In the London area. It was either London or Bristol. I'm pretty sure. Well, it eventually he came to London, and
I will say too, immediately, like, people knew that this guy had the gift of preaching. Yeah,
a special gift, because testimonies say, he's one of the greatest orators in pretty much in history.
He's one of those guys that, I'd hate to have the technology of computers and video and stuff back then, but to have a YouTube clip of him preaching would be very interesting to watch.
That'd be great. Now, to explain this, we have to give some of his background in his life, because he actually grew up training for acting.
Yep.
He was basically a trained actor. Yeah. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, he used to, when he was a kid, he would pretend to be a preacher. I think
maybe. I believe his mother owned like an inn or something.
Yeah,
he would basically just entertain the people there.
At the very least, he was an actor.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Before he went to study for the for the ministry.
Yeah.
So that's part of the reason why he was such a noteworthy preacher, because he put his all into it. He would basically act out his sermon while he was preaching.
And this was wildly different from what people were used to.
Right.
This time most of the sermons, well, in England, if you're going to the Church of England, it's usually just a pre-written prayer. But even in
or a homily,
yeah,
or a sermon.
And even in New England, though, most of those sermons were just read, written down, not that they were bad sermons, but written down and read off. Right. And so to see this guy as like an actor, very emotional, up there, and just belting it out, apparently he was able to project his voice to thousands and thousands of people. It was something completely unique. Right. People weren't used to that.
And not only that, but most of the preachers in the Church of England. So at this point in time, they had moved from Puritan preaching, which was hugely doctrinal. It was biblically based on the essential tenets of the New Testament. They had moved to this more sentimental, from what I learned through my study, this more sentimental type of preaching that did not emphasize salvation. It emphasized basically just be a good person. It was kind of like moralism. Yeah. It basically do these good things, be a good citizen, be a good church member. While on the other hand, George Whitefield's main teaching was being born again, having God's... Well, we know from the way he was converted was by reading a book specifically on the new birth, on regeneration. That was his main tenet, that you had to have life from God, new life from God, that you were dead in your trespasses and sins, an enemy of God, under his wrath, heading for hell, for eternal destruction. In order to have pardon and mercy, God had to work in your soul. God had to give you new life. And actually, the way he put this, I think, oftentimes from, at least I was listening to a sermon yesterday, and he, from what I gather, actually, a lot of times he made it seem, I'm not sure if he actually believed this, maybe he was just, the way that he presented it was this way, but you had to repent and put your trust in Jesus in order to receive God's new life. Now there's a doctrinal issue there, because it's not doctrinally precise, but that's the way he kind of put it. In order to have God's life from above, the new birth, you had to have faith. You had to have faith in Jesus. His preaching was extremely personal. It was extremely emotional. It was extremely directed right at the hearers, and he had a squint in it. He had a squint in his eyes, like a malady of his eyes where he couldn't look straight. So people thought that he was squinting directly at them. So go back to his preaching in London. He started in the churches, but eventually there were so many people coming to the churches, he had to go outside.
I also think there was one of the people that was not with him, but that he was aligned with, started calling out some of the Anglican preachers as not being saved.
Oh, okay.
And he publicly agreed with them, and so then you get a lot of the churches are saying, no, you can't preach here.
Place. And also he thought that at this time we have to also remember, actually, believe it or not, even though the Church of England was huge, probably a majority of the population still attended church.
Yeah.
And yet there were droves of people that were non-church attenders, because people had fallen off from church attendance. So he thought, what besides that other consideration, this is also a great opportunity to preach to those people who don't go to church. And actually he got this idea from a Welsh preacher from Wales, who was actually a school teacher, and he had actually quit school, being a school teacher, so that he could preach the gospel. And he is the one who pioneered open air preaching in Great Britain. His name was Howell Harris, and he actually wrote to Whitefield. Well, actually, he invited Whitefield to Wales to watch him preach. And so Whitefield learned open air preaching from this layman who was not a clergyman, who was what he didn't call it preaching, he called it exhorting, because laymen were not allowed to preach. So he was preaching the gospel in the open air. He would go to fairs, marketplaces and such where people were gathered, and he would bring a stool or something and stand on it, and he would preach to people. So Whitefield learned this from him, and he eventually came to do it himself. And he was the first clergyman who did this. And actually, open air preaching, Whitefield was the one who actually got John Wesley into open air preaching. In fact, John Wesley at the start, when he was saved, all he wanted to do was preach the gospel within the church, within the practiced common church services. But actually, Whitefield kind of forced him one day at a meeting that they were planning on having by announcing that John Wesley was going to preach. And so John Wesley was basically compulsed by Whitefield into doing open air preaching. And he kind of reluctantly at the start thought, eventually or thought that I might as well do this because there are droves of people that are not going to church, and so this is a good way to reach them by doing open air preaching. So John Wesley, he went around, open air preaching in England. He stayed in England.
I think George Whitefield had huge success with open air preaching, especially to the coal mining community.
Right, and that was in the town Moorsfields.
I don't remember. I do remember the story, like the first time he preached to them, and he looks out after he preaches, and he just sees these white streaks down under their eyes because they had like black sooten faces.
Right, and
the white streaks being tear lines.
Right. In order to give a context for that, I'm pretty sure it was Moorfields, the town of Moorfields. Most of the inhabitants of that town did not go to church. In fact, they were hostile to the Church of England. They were basically pagans. They were basically a bunch of redneck, impoverished. And in fact, whole families would work in the coal mines. Not just the men. Even their wives and their children would work in the coal mines. And yet Whitefield went to them. They didn't have a church there. And they actually he actually went door to door saying, "I'm going to preach at such and such a place at such and such a time," and hundreds of them gathered to hear him the first time. And like you said, they were so affected that they had the tears streaming down their faces. And the next meeting, there were like thousands that came to him. Or at least over 1,000. And he spent some time there preaching, and at the end they had come to love him, and many of them had been saved. Almost this whole town had come to be saved, and they decided to build a school, I think, and also a church building there. So that's kind of like his first main work that he did. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
So, just with the combination of Whitefield and John Wesley, and so I think Whitefield had this ministry that you just described, but then he feels the call or answers the call to go to America. He hears about the start of the Great Awakening, that there's or an awakening over there, revival's happening. He wants to go to America, and so he basically talks to John Wesley and says, leaves his ministry in John Wesley's hands. And that's where you see, I think, John Wesley is not the preacher that George Whitefield was. I mean, nobody was.
But he was far less.
He was a very gifted administrator.
Right.
And so I think you see him build up the start of like the Methodist Church. That idea from there.
Yeah, in order to flesh that out a little bit, actually, when they were started preaching, Wesley and Whitefield, the people from the churches that were converted, they invited to form into what they called societies. Methodist societies, which were basically the true church within the established church. They were truly saved people who would gather in homes or other places besides the church building for Bible study, for prayer, for accountability. So they were basically instilling New Testament Christianity to them. And this like you said, this was the start of the Methodist movement. They were originally Methodism were these societies which had leaders over them who were called preachers, and then the rest of them were called classes. And so John Wesley took over when Whitefield went to America, to Georgia, under Oglethorpe, the governor there, and he actually established. When he was over there, he established an orphanage, or at least began the work on an orphanage for specifically for black children. I believe. Eventually, it mostly came to house black children, because they were the most impoverished orphans. They didn't have, and obviously the racism had probably started. There was slavery still back then. But let's back up, because if we go on to the American colonies, because this is, I believe, his first trip was in 1738.
Yep.
To Georgia. Before that time, though, in 1734, you have Jonathan Edwards.
So let's go even before 1734 and introduce Jonathan Edwards.
Okay.
So he was born into a very prominent Puritan family in New England.
Mm-hmm.
His mother's father was Solomon Stoddard, who was sometimes referred to as like the Pope of the region. I mean, not in a negative way, but in just he was a pastor that was respected. I mean, he lived into his 80s and pastored the same church for over 60 years and just respected by all the churches around. People would, different pastors would go to him for his opinions on things. So just a highly respected, one of the most famous pastors in all of New England. And then his father, was it Thomas Edwards? His father was also a pastor. And he had 12 sisters. And his father raised him basically, and his sisters as well, to be incredibly educated, and sent him to, I think it was Yale.
Yeah.
At age 13.
So at that point in time, Yale was mostly a seminary, basically.
Yeah. So it's funny. College. I mean, Harvard was established for the same purpose, to raise up missionaries and preachers. And then Yale was established because people thought Harvard had gotten too liberal. Which I'm sure if we went back there now and looked at them, we'd think they were quite conservative. But
so Jonathan Edwards actually he began his studies at age 13.
Yep. And I wish I had written them down, but the list of things he studied was incredible as a 13-year-old. I mean, there were like 15 or 20 subjects, and they're all like, some of them you're like, all right, that makes sense, and some of them you're like, wow, that's intense.
Right.
But so by the time he graduated, I think he was 18, or he was saved when he was 18. Maybe it was the same, but he was,
or a little bit.
But he was easily top of his class. People could tell that he was a very, very intelligent young man.
Oh yeah.
And had just mastered, a whole bunch of different languages, philosophy, logic, rhetoric, all these subjects that he undertook.
At the very least, he knew Greek, Hebrew, and Latin.
Yeah. And so it's not till he's 18, even though he lived under his father, who was a pastor, that he is born again. And I believe he is actually asked to preach some in a maybe New York City for a little bit as an itinerant, or as to fill in,
assistant, or something like that.
And then he goes back to home and actually gets to be an assistant to his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, and this is basically sets him up well in that Solomon Stoddard at this point is like 80 something, so it's basically seen as, you're going to take over after him, and this is one of the most prominent churches in all of New England.
That was Northampton?
I think so, yeah.
Right, Massachusetts?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so he leads the church for quite a while. And in 1734 is when the revival happens.
Yeah.
Now, we need to give some background about the condition of the New England churches in Massachusetts specifically, where he was the colony where he was pastoring. They had instituted this thing called the halfway covenant, which allowed unbelieving church members to agree to the church covenant and to be outwardly religious and moral, and then if they did that, they would be allowed to have their children baptized. Because we have to remember, in Massachusetts and in many of the other New England colonies, to be a church member, just like in the Church of England, to be a church member was to be a citizen, with the right of voting in the colony. In order to have full rights of citizenship, you had to be a church member, because the church was basically connected to the state. The state actually ran the church for the most part, and a little bit of vice versa as well. So because of this, many unsaved people were church members, and also largely due to this, many of the pastors were unsaved as well, unfortunately, as we'll find out as we're discussing how the revival went forward in New England. So Jonathan Edwards is pastoring a congregation. I think it's probably, I forgot how big it was. It was like a little more than a couple dozen or something.
I'm not sure.
Something like that. But so they were mostly outwardly moral. I forgot what led him. No. Okay. So the story is, well, it's the true story, but the youth of his town of Northampton, they were actually what he considered very immoral. They would basically party all night. They would dance. They would play games on Sunday when you're not supposed to play games. They would stay up late. Basically, I think there was a lot of there's probably sexual immorality. That's probably something that he at least implies in his descriptions of them. So the youth of the town were debaucherous. Most of them, at least a large portion of them. And obviously, in that society, it was the responsibility of the parents to keep their children under control. So this also implied that the parents were not doing what they were supposed to do. So Jonathan Edwards sees that his town is basically immoral. They are, for the most part, he doesn't think they're believers. They're unsaved. They are, and also they don't. They might go to church, but outside of church, they basically live completely different lives with no regard for religion. So it's kind of similar to the condition in Great Britain, where immorality was hugely practiced and they were irreverent. So what Jonathan Edwards decides to do is preach a series of sermons on the doctrine of justification by faith. And after he preaches this a while, as he recounts in his what he calls the narrative of surprising conversions, people are coming to him, with concern for their souls, that they're not saved. They don't actually have this faith of justification, and eventually, like the whole congregation, most of the congregation comes to see that that don't actually know the Lord, and they're coming to him personally over the course of months, saying that they want to know how to be saved, and he has to do private counseling. And so eventually, the whole town most of the town comes to have an experience of conversion, and his congregation actually grows to a large proportion. And then in 1730, was it 1735? He goes to Enfield.
34, I think.
That's the same year.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is asked to go to our neighboring town of Enfield, which famously is where he had already preached the famous sermon "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" at his own congregation with no effect. Basically. Yeah. But he preaches it in the same way to the congregation in Enfield, and basically the whole congregation comes under conviction of sin. In this meeting, people are shrieking, for fear for their souls. They're saying, "I'm going to hell. What can I do?" They're like falling on the floor or these types of things. And like the congregation comes to be saved. Yeah. And so there's huge revival in the town of Enfield, which is in Connecticut.
Which actually, if I could pause there, to point out a little bit of the difference between George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, is so as we described George Whitefield and how he would preach. Yeah. And his was largely extemporaneous. He would feel the crowd and move whichever direction.
And he didn't come prepared with notes. Yeah. He would go without any notes.
So Jonathan Edwards would write, when Chris says that he preached sinners in the hands of an angry God once, and then he just, he already had it all written out. He would read it essentially as he preached, and so he takes it. And so now we see Whitefield is known as one of the greatest preachers of all time. Jonathan Edwards is known as one of the greatest theologian thinkers in America because he was more the written word. That you get more theology that he's writing down, and his sermons are all written down, and people are able to read them, and they get more distributed. They go to Europe. Europe actually, he's the first guy that Europe had in America respect for. Had respect for in America. Gotcha. Is America's actually got a good thinker over there. Whereas, like I said, compared to Whitefield was more of an itinerant preacher that would just, like Chris said, without notes and just. The people, he was a celebrity to the people, whereas Edwards was the writer, theologian more type.
He was kind of at least in the towns where he preached, he was a celebrity. Because, but it wasn't because of his oratory.
Yeah, and it wasn't to Whitefield's levels either.
Right, that's correct. But there was this revival, and I believe that to go to another group of people, the Tennents, they were Presbyterians. Okay, so you have Whitefield, he's an Anglican. And John Wesley and Charles Wesley, they're Anglicans. Jonathan Edwards was a Congregationalist, basically a Puritan. And then you have the Tennents in Pennsylvania around this time, at least the early 1740s. They were Presbyterians in Pennsylvania. And William Tennent, you said was the father?
I believe it was William Tennent Sr., yeah.
Yeah, so he actually founded basically a seminary. It was nicknamed the Log Cabin because it was literally a log cabin.
Yeah, it had I think he had 5 of his sons in it and 10 other kids roughly, or guys that he trained up to preach.
Right. So it was not. They did not.
Now, that became Princeton, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, Princeton actually moved to New Jersey, but that was the foundation.
But
of Princeton.
That's what I'm saying.
The staff there, they basically planned and started Princeton in New Jersey.
Yeah.
But this was they weren't slackers. This was pretty much as good of a theological education as you could get from the major seminaries in New England, like Harvard and Yale.
Yeah.
This place in Pennsylvania. And so these preachers, the brothers were Gilbert and was it William Jr.?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, Gilbert and William Tennent. They were huge preachers. They were very gifted. I think so. Gilbert went to was it New Jersey that he went to first?
I'm trying to remember. He ended up. I know there was one section where when Whitefield went through, after he saw how much the Spirit was moving in there, he asked, I think it was Gilbert, to basically continue the circuit in that area for a few months to keep the revival going, and that may have been Connecticut that he asked him to do that later. It could have been New Jersey.
Okay, well, Gilbert at least, I think it was Gilbert. he eventually became an itinerant preacher, evangelist. He visited places besides Pennsylvania. In fact, at one point he went to New England to follow up the revival that was going on through Jonathan Edwards. So there were itinerant preachers going to New England, and the established the preachers.
Yeah.
Of
Oh,
most
sorry.
times,
So after Jonathan Edwards had the second preaching of the sinners in the hand of an angry God, and where the people are like crying out, he did write a letter out to other people basically saying that the Spirit is moving here. And so then you get a lot of these itinerant preachers who are interested in coming, and it kind of spreads it around the whole New England area. So go ahead.
Yeah, but most of the preachers there, most of the pastors did not like this.
Yeah.
Because what it was implying was that they were not sufficient, that they were not doing their jobs, and that other preachers needed to come in order for people to actually get the Word of God. So there was this split between those who were promoters of the revival and those who were, dead set against it. There was actually a prominent clergyman in Boston, forgot what his name was. Who was hugely in opposition to it. He was a major Puritan, but there were many of them.
Yeah.
But Jonathan Edwards, he wrote a narrative of surprising conversions about that revival, and also a work called An Account of the Revival of Religion in Northampton. And he had to defend the revival against those who said it was simply an emotional, fervor.
Which really brings up an interesting point to think about as far as that fine line of you want individual conversions, you want the Holy Spirit working in a zealousness, in each person, but there is a danger of just stirring up emotion and having that just be an emotional experience. So which I think the first Great Awakening, as we talked about before, was more theologically sound, so that there were more conversions. But
as compared to the second,
you get to the second Great Awakening, it very much becomes more just this: let's stir up emotion and get people to come forward and say that they, and convert.
Yeah, because most of the preachers, the prominent preachers, in the first Great Awakening that saw huge numbers converted under their preaching were Calvinists. The exception to this were the Wesleys, at least in the beginning. Charles Wesley actually eventually came to Calvinism, or at least more Calvinists than Arminian. John Wesley, obviously, he is the leading Arminian figure in this era. So back to the Tennents, or the revival in New England. There's this split between the separatists. Actually, because of the revival, because there were so many people being converted, there were new churches, new congregations formed with new leaders over them. So there was kind of a split between the old people, the established traditionalists that were against the revival, and those who were for the revival. And because of these excesses, there were emotional. Now, Jonathan Edwards and some of the revivalists, some of the preachers in the revival did recognize there were excesses. There were cases in which people were just getting worked up, and they just wanted the experience.
And they were trying to keep in check. Like mysticism was definitely starting to go on too, as far as I forget where I read that, but so like Jonathan Edwards was trying to also keep that in check,
right?
And you do get more. I forget which guy it was. One of the itinerant preachers would just open it up to whoever would be like, I have a feeling from the Lord, and get up and speak,
gotcha.
Which opens up a can of worms as far as depending on what they say,
right?
And you get, and obviously the regular preachers are very unhappy about this, to be like, no, you can't just let any layman come up and say whatever they're feeling,
right.
That's uneducated.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Say anything more. All right. Well, in order to make a clear explanation of what is true, what is actually true or true work of the Spirit, and what are just these, just ridiculous psychological, I guess, uproars and emotional extravagancies or excesses. Jonathan Edwards wrote a famous work called A Treatise on Religious Affections, which basically, it distinguished between what is a true conversion and what can accompany it, and then what are false conversions. Basically, what are these emotional I don't know what the word is, emotional excesses, basically, that people just get worked up and have an experience, and then nothing results from it. There's no true conversion. They don't actually go on to follow Jesus and to join a church and be a faithful church member.
Yeah.
But there were many of them.
Which we still see that today.
Yeah.
Where happens a lot, where a preacher comes through, or there's some great event, and it's really emotional, and you get a lot of people that are converted, or supposedly converted, but, how do you tell if it's just, they're feeling really emotional, they feel like they felt something, so they went forward or whatever, said a prayer, and it's still, I think probably as long as Christianity will go, it is still something to look for, a danger of just watching the emotion take over instead of true Christian faith.
Right. Yeah. And in New England, I just want to note that like shrieking, falling on the ground, these like people like shaking uncontrollably and going into trances, and then like being unable to speak for hours on end or something like that. This was actually a common occurrence in New England during these revivals. It's not like it was an isolated event. It was happening all over the place in these congregations where the preachers would go, but I don't hear of that sort of thing so much in the other colonies, which is interesting. But to go on to the other colonies, back to Whitefield, because he had much more work that he did besides his preaching in the London area and going to Georgia, because he made 7 trips to America. He traveled hundreds of thousands of miles.
Yeah.
So you have to imagine. So he's traveling across the Atlantic. That takes months.
Yeah.
To
about 3 months, they said, usually.
Yeah, to go across the Atlantic. So he goes first to Georgia to establish that orphan house. He goes back to England to raise funds for it. And he preaches around there, and they're willing to give to it. He goes back to America because basically he's handed over the Methodist work to John and Charles Wesley, and he goes back to America, and his most significant and fruitful work is in 1740 to 41 or 41 to 42.
Yeah, his second trip. Yeah,
41. Yeah, his second trip. Thousands are converted. So I don't know where he starts, but he makes a tour.
I thought it was Philadelphia for some reason, but
that sounds right.
But so also a little interesting thing on this, they estimate that 75% of the colonists saw Whitefield preach, which is
saw him,
yes,
right.
And then on top of that, so when he would preach in cities, say if he preached in Philadelphia, the crowds that would come to see him would be about double the size of the city's population.
Right. So you have his largest crowds were tens of thousands of people.
Which actually, if you've ever read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography,
no.
Him and Whitefield actually became friends.
Right.
And Benjamin Franklin writes about him. It says, first of all, he heard about this Whitefield guy and about how he could project his voice so well. And Benjamin Franklin's like, that's impossible. And so he's like, I'm going to do an experiment when he's preaching. So he actually walked around the town measuring where he could hear and where he couldn't. And he was just astounded because he's like, I don't see how this is physically possible. That and he estimated that 30,000 people could actually hear him, which is, there's no microphones. That's remarkable. And then the other thing I remember he wrote about him was that...
So, how far away could he project his voice?
It was like...
So miles, right?
Yeah, like he was like... We're talking Benjamin Franklin...
At least a couple miles.
Was like walking around in the streets in Philadelphia, like going down the streets being like, I can still hear him.
Now we have to remember, at this point, they don't have tall buildings like Philadelphia
and also,
is.
Philadelphia is not the city
smaller.
that it is now. We're talking it had like 10 or 15,000 people living in it. But still... And then the other thing I remember Benjamin Franklin wrote about him was that he's like, what I've learned is when I go to listen to George Whitefield preach, I need to take no money with me whatsoever, because when the offering comes around, I just can't help it because it's so emotional. and then he's like, and I did that, and you know what happened? I borrowed money from the guy next to me so I could put it in the offering.
Now we have to remember, so when Whitefield took an offering, it was not for himself. It was actually for his orphan house.
Yeah.
In Georgia. That's what he took the offering for, and many people gave to it because he would give an appeal. It would give an appeal to it, as well as preach the gospel to people. So there were thousands that were affected. That's my. So we got to start wrapping it up.
I guess I'd say off that last point, to think too, just looking forward, and there's a big debate over what role this played, but looking forward towards the American Revolution. This is about 30 years before the American Revolution, and a lot of people will argue that this was a major factor in kind of bringing the colonies together, in having a similar shared experience, I guess, and just that it set up the next generation to head that direction.
It's possible,
but like I said, it's debated because other people will say, like, did it really?
But the revolution was more political than religious.
Yeah.
But we, at the very least, we have to recognize that a huge percent of the population, probably at least half, I'd say, were most likely converted in the revival, not just through Whitefield, mostly through Whitefield's preaching. And also we have to remember, it wasn't just his preaching. His sermons were also printed and sold and distributed. So you have thousands of people not just hearing his sermons personally, but also reading his sermons and being saved through reading his sermons. That was a huge part of his ministry. So I forgot when he died.
I think it was 1770.
Really?
I think he lived. Yeah.
Yeah. He made 7 trips. So 5 other trips besides
I remember an estimate that he preached 30,000 sermons in his life.
Wow.
And a lot of times he'd do 3 a day.
Right, and he would preach pretty much every day.
Yeah, and it'd be like he would like finish a sermon and go to like where he was sleeping that night, and a crowd of people would just follow him, and so he'd just step outside and preach again. Okay.
Yeah. So the results of the Great Awakening.
Oh, I did want to say too. I think a noteworthy is in the South, especially, you get the Baptists and the Methodists really start to. They're not much at this point, but they start to get their churches out there because the South.
Well, actually, remember there were no Methodists in the American colonies at this point.
Yeah, so
not yet.
But the Baptists for sure take root. I mean, we see it still today. That's where a lot of Baptists are. In that this is more of a rural area. Mm-hmm. It's less cities, and the educated, like the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, aren't doing as well to get down there. And the Baptists, though they don't have that education, have more of a drive to like, let's put a church in every little village we can and get a preacher out to every little rural area. And they really felt a weight to reach the South that they felt like was falling spiritually behind, because a lot of them were just so far from any church that like they couldn't go to church on Sunday. Right. And so that's where you see the Baptists really come into the South, and in a movement to try to reach Southerners during this Great Awakening, when obviously the North and the Middle colonies were having huge effects from it, and a lot of people coming to hear preachers.
Yeah, we have to remember also the Baptists in the American colonies actually started in New England.
Yeah,
so they went south from New England. Yeah. But like you said, so not just the Baptists, but there was the forming and the starting of many hundred, probably dozens, if not hundreds, of new churches, new congregations because of the revival They had so many people being saved, so they had to start new churches. You have like you said, the beginning of Princeton. Princeton was one of them that was founded because of the revival.
Dartmouth was.
Yeah. I think those are the two main ones. At least. These institutions for the training of preachers. You also have a huge impetus and catalyst for missions to the Native Americans, especially. For example, one prominent figure was David Brainerd, who was a Congregationalist evangelist who had a huge impact on a specific Native group in the New England area that came to be saved. Like a whole town was saved through his preaching. Jonathan Edwards was an admirer of him. And then, so most, I'd say, there were clearly thousands of people saved in the American colonies. Likewise in Great Britain. And so you have the founding of the Methodist societies, which eventually... So John Wesley actually lived until 1791, I think, is when he died. He was continuing to grow the Methodist movement. These societies were established. And not just him, but he actually trained many preachers, evangelists, to go out. And actually most of them were untrained, uneducated people who would go around, and they suffered horribly. Especially in Great Britain, they suffered because so much of the population were unbelievers and hated the gospel just like people naturally do. So Methodism was basically established in Great Britain due to the Great Awakening,
which I do think, I don't know when but at some point John Wesley was organizing preachers of his Methodists to go to America.
Oh, okay.
But it could have been towards the end of his life, but I do remember listening that he personally was sending preachers.
Yeah, it was. I remember studying long ago. It was around the late 1700s that Methodism began in the American colonies.
And then going forward with the Methodists, it was similar with the Baptists, where maybe not as theologically sound or as educated as some of those Eastern versions of like Presbyterian or Congregationalists. But very much more like we got to get a church in every town. We're going to keep moving west with the people. We will have somebody for them there, and that's why today you see a Baptist church and a Methodist church are like the default ones in most towns.
Yeah, right.
I mean, obviously, location specific. Some locations are a little different, but
in Great Britain, so there were social reforms from the revival in Great Britain. At least that was the beginning seeds of it. There were reforms for the poor. There were societies formed to care for the poor, especially poor children, working families. There were slavery was, I think it was the late 1700s when it was abolished in Great Britain.
Yeah.
There was a huge anti-slavery movement because of the revival, because so many people were coming to be saved and seeing that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to look into William Wilberforce.
Right, he was a leading figure. He might have been in the early 1800s.
Yeah, he'd be an interesting one to look.
But it was because Christianity had spread that this push for the abolition, for the illegality of slavery was pushed. So there was social reform and in Great Britain, and Methodism. Besides that, I can't think of it. Well, there was a huge... So instead of preaching being just doctrinal, just basically these lectures, preaching because of Whitefield and other revival preachers became more personal, more applicable to people. Evangelism obviously was hugely promoted through the revival, and also the missionary movement, I believe, because of Methodism, in a large part, and because of the revival, because so many people were saved. Again, just like the American colonies, thousands of people were saved over the course of the mid and late 1700s due to the revival in Great Britain. And so there was a huge missionary movement which began around the turn of the 19th century, 1700s to 1800s. That's when the first missionary movement began. And actually, Baptists also began in the latter part of the 1700s to become more bold and more, I guess, effective and diligent in their work. So that's the Great Awakening. It's a huge deal. We don't see anything like that until the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. And do you think we would benefit from a Great Awakening today, Casey?
I do. I mean, I obviously think we do. I would want to be careful with our society, kind of as we were saying earlier, not to have it just be some emotional. I think it would be very easy for our society to make it emotional and to also have it come off the rails doctrinally. So if we are able to not have those two things take over, I absolutely think it would be an amazing thing to have happen.
Yeah, so let's pray for revival, for preaching, for actually, I think the main thing we can learn from the Great Awakening is preach the gospel. Just share the gospel with people, because that was the main instrument
and
that God
really
used.
To think too, I think on a personal level, is a great awakening of one soul is a victory. I mean, like we can sit here and think like, to have thousands of people just come to the Lord would be great, and it would, but on an individual level of like every soul won to the Lord, like the angels rejoice.
Right, and it has to start with the body of Christ. We have to be letting our light shine before men in such a way that they'll see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. It has to start with us. We have to be being faithful to the Lord in order for people to see the power and truth of the gospel, as well as because we are so cowardly and self-serving and lazy, we need to open our mouths and actually share the truths with people. So that's, I guess that we could say a lot more, but that's a general overview of the Great Awakening. Thank you for listening to this edition to the King's Hand in History podcast. Next time, I think we'll follow up with the Great Awakening on a more specific topic. And until then, seek the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ in all that you do. Thanks again. If you're on Facebook, we have a Facebook group called the King's Hand in History Students. You're welcome to ask to join. And again, thank you for listening, and God bless.